Now we're going to paint the background. Now this is up to you. If you love it the way it is and you want to let it go, that's fine. But I find a lot of people like the colorful background to go with it. So what I have to do is take out these pins. And we are going to take the board out from inside. Because we need a bigger area. And we are switching to a bigger board, which is a 14 by 18 in this case. Well, maybe we better go to the 16 by 20. I keep a lot of sizes handy. Yeah, that looks better. We want to cover the inside of this so that when we're having it all wet, it doesn't bleed through to the back. I just slide the board up in there and I leave it loose. Now you're going to want to grab a 1 or 2 inch sponge brush. And I hope you got clean water. And I like to stand up a lot of times for these things. And a lot of times when I would paint this on my own, I would just paint it all on this type of a board. But for me, to work on this area, I would keep banging into all of this down here and sticking my head under the camera, and that you wouldn't enjoy that. I think you would rather have it done this way so that you can see it better. Okay, the first step is to start wetting your surface. Now each surface is going to take the water differently. And so you also do not want to choose a stain resistant surface or it will repel your water. This thicker one is going to take a lot longer to absorb the water. A thinner shirt will absorb it right away. And you can see where I'm going here. I'm staying around 1 inch away from my painting. It will bleed up into that, and even if it doesn't, then I can coax it to and I can control how much of it is bled up into there. And I'm kind of smashing some of these water droplets into my shirt. This takes a little bit of time. We want to wet it all up first, then we'll get our paint out while we're letting it saturate. It takes quite a while for it to saturate your fabric and to thoroughly bleed the way it's going to bleed. Okay, you can see that pretty well. You can really see where it's dry. If you have a white shirt, you won't be able to see it as well, but when you touch it, you can feel it. You can feel the dry spots. So I can start coaxing it up in a little closer to my flower. And my dragonfly. And also you want to make sure it's wet all the way out here as wide as your board goes. Because even though we don't plan on painting all the way out there, we want there to be water there for it to bleed. I can see a lot of water laying in here. Trying to coax it down there a little closer. Then you just have to stop and be a little bit patient. Tap a little bit in there. to bleed some more down here. I'm just going to probably paint about this far. Now where I see places like this, I want to make sure that it looks, for me, a darker pink everywhere. So if I need to get it wetter, I can get it wetter. And mine feels really wet, but this is a heavy shirt. Like a sweatshirt, it's taken quite a bit of water. Sweatshirts take a lot of water. Sort of patting it in, saying, here, get wet, which is why I like these canvas panels. They can stand a lot of this moisture that I'm adding in here. So while we've got that soaking for us, we can get out our palette. Now we're going to want to think about what looks good. We already know we do not want to use the dark rose because it's not going to show up. You don't want to use a color that you can tell has white in it because it'll be too milky. And so that puts out the wisteria as well. That leaves us with crimson, dioxazine purple, and Hauser green as our colors to help our background and to set our flower off. So we'll get those out while we're letting this saturate. I think my palette's still a little bit wet from washing it. There we go. And then you're going to want to use your biggest brush, and we can use a bit smaller one too to get around the edges. So keep out your 4, your 6, and grab yourself an 8 for your background. And at this point too, I might even recommend you go get yourself a drink of water, because it's not a bad idea just to let this bleed for 15 minutes or so that you know how far it's going to go and what's going to happen. Now if you look at this, it's getting pretty wet. Do you see how it's bled out a little bit and encroached on my flower? And that's fine. What I'm going to do to paint this background, I want to think about what colors would look good next to some of these areas. Probably the purples and greens down in here and the purples and crimsons up into here. I'm going to take my number 8 brush, I'm going to get it wet, blot it on the paper towel. I guess I haven't used it yet today, so let's wet it and then wet it again. And let it suck just a little water out because I want it to be 50% wet. And then I am going to go into the edge of my paint here, and I'm going to work it well into the bristles of my brush. I want it very well saturated with nice soupy paint, and you can set that aside. And then right up against the flower here, I am going to paint my purple, and I know it's dry right there, and then I'm going to pull it out into the wet area, and that'll make it bleed. But because it's dry right against here, it won't bleed into my leaves or my flower or any of my painting and ruin them. And I think we could even use some crimson in there. I think that might be pretty. Remember, we were putting crimson over the purple as it was. Let's see what happens when we do that. So you're just going to go along here. You want to set off these edges, help them to show up. By applying this heavy saturation of paint. Get my brush wet again, blot it. As I come farther up, I like to use lighter colors, so I'm going to switch to the crimson. And I want to make sure it is wet, because that's what'll help it bleed into the rest of this. If it looks like I'm losing some of my nice darks as it's bleeding, I can come back and put some more in. And like I said, I need to get the red out of my brush, the crimson, because it will fight with the Hauser green, but the purple won't. Alright, let's grab some of the green. And let's say I need some green in here too. Kind of pretend that there is another peony back in here, and we'll just let a bit of green happen right around in there. I know it's funny, on film this looks really splotchy, but in real life it ends up looking really good as it bleeds out. And we can coax it a little bit, but you don't need to worry too much about it. It's really going to do a lot on its own. Wetting my brush again, going back into the purple, and I want to paint it on around. It's got to be wet, but not so the paint is running or dripping off the end of your brush, because I want it to blend into this wetter background. And I turned my painting so that I could come right up against this edge here with my purple, and I'm pulling on it so it'll just go on out there and bleed wherever it wants to bleed to. This will get a lot lighter. If you've done watercolors, you know how that is. It's going to dry much, much lighter. So I'm getting this now to bleed. Up against my leaf, and I'm pulling it out with my nice soupy paint. And over here, let's grab into some of our crimson as well. Probably could use some tints of it along in here. Oh, let's see, as we proceed on up into there, probably better get some wet purple into this area too, so that it looks like it was purple all the way across. So we want some of that to bleed on into there. Looks like I got it plenty wet. That will just make a lot lighter value in the coloring. And I could switch to a smaller brush to get into those corners. Grab a little more pigment again here, some color on this. I would recommend you not do the background until your painting is either dry or almost dry. You don't want to have just finished painting it so that the paint could get on your hands when you touch it, or could bleed when you're doing this. Okay, we did work some green off into some of these areas over here, so let's get a little green going there. Clean the green out of my brush before I go back into the crimson. I want to use some crimson in my brush up into this area. And I'm coming in with that chisel edge of my brush right up against there. And it would probably be easier if I used a smaller brush. But you know how that is when you try to hurry here. It goes so much faster with a big brush, unless of course you have to struggle with getting the paint on, and then it really doesn't. So here's our smaller brush. Getting there in those little tiny corners. And I could turn the entire piece. Grab some purple now. Get a little purple shading in there. That'll really help to lift that edge. And then we come over here and we do the same thing. Just sort of working up on our design. I like to keep it a lot darker, heavier application of paint farther down in here, and then I barely do anything up into here. And we're starting to work out of our tight little area there, running out of water in my brush. Some red over here on that side. Wet my brush again because it's very dry right here. We didn't let the water bleed very much into that area. Probably even get a little bit of purple right there to help lift that little edge up. And looks like we could get into, oops, I didn't blot it. Come around this edge here carefully. And I'm probably going to switch to purple around the flower because that'll show up better. Finish up our leaf here. Turn it some more so that we can get right down there against that, covering up all of our pink shirt. And we can come in from this edge too. And then we can grab some purple as we come out around the flower. We could even grab some green there. Will help our flower show up, since green and red are complementary colors. So just work it carefully, coming up around all of these things. Use whatever size brush fits in your area well. Start coming up around the flower with some purple to set that off. And then we'll just fade it out into practically nothing up around the top of the flower. Okay, I know it looks kind of splotchy right now, but remember, it's going to dry. It's going to dry and it's going to fade. Or then maybe you want it kind of splotchy. You can take your bigger brush, wet it again, grab some purple, and just make some loose strokes out into here, and those are going to fade and soften as it dries. And like I said, we don't want a lot of paint up around the top of the flower. We like to keep that fairly soft. Get around our leaves and a couple of these petals here. We could go around the whole flower with the crimson and see if that would help it show up, but it was looking pretty good as it was. I think now the way we've got it painted, it's really not a problem. I'm going to need to get some more purple out here. You just want a watery, wet background basically. Oh, we could use some purple, some Hauser green. We pretend that there's more flowers out here. And those are the suggestions of the flowers. Let's work a little more up around in this area. So I turned my piece so that I could come up along here carefully. I want to smooth this out a bit so I don't have it as streaky. Streak some purple up into here. I could have a little purple going on here as we come up into the dragonfly since it was painted crimson. And again, I think I'm going to have to switch to my smaller brush so that I can do that. Carefully paint up around my dragonfly. Remember, you didn't get it wet here, so your brush is going to need to be wet to help this bleed. We could even use a little bit of a crimson. Crimson might look good up along in here since the wings had purple in them, and then more purple against the body. Just want to think about the things that'll help stuff show up good. Just kind of grab your paint colors here. Here again, we can grab a little bit of green. Work that into our edges. And this is something that you can just play with for a really long time. Or you can just stop and let it go, and you can come back in an hour and see what the paint has done during that amount of time. And you may see areas where it's faded more than you wanted it to, and you can strengthen it by adding more paint. We can continue on. Right in here, we could add purple to help lift these edges. And we've got a little ruffle, couple little ruffles there, so we can help pop up our ruffles by getting some purple. And we want a little bit of our crimson in there to help tie it together. And we're going to need to use a bit of a wash of the crimson here up against our butterfly and over our little feet so we don't lose them. If we used purple, we would lose them. Continue on around the top of our peony here. So as long as you've got lighter edges here, the purple works good around the peony. If you've got some edges that have already been shaded with purple, then you're going to need to use the crimson. Like I said, I generally like to keep it fairly light in these areas, but I felt like I needed some kind of paint up in here to help it tie into everything else. I switched back to my larger brush just to get a lot of paint on up in this area. There just was nothing happening here. I want to help it go with the rest of the picture. Rinse that one out. And I keep using up all my paint. We're just about done here. And then what we want to do is, if you like the sparkle, I like to just whisk some glimmer all over the background. Just have this side of the peony to do yet. Come around these edges. With my soupy paint, because I want to make sure this is going to bleed. Oh, I forgot about getting some green in here. I keep forgetting we could have some of our green tints out here too. Finish up with our purple. You just keep working on this. And like I said, go take a walk. Come back in a half an hour or an hour. Check and see what it's doing. And after it's done, has bled some and softened the colors and everything, then we're going to add some glimmer all around on the background. You just want to get all around all your elements if that's what you choose to do. I don't always do this. On my first one, I didn't do all of it. I kept it really light up around the top of the flower. That's a little bit hard to keep the brush strokes at a minimum with the small brush. So let's switch back as we finish out here to the bigger brush, because it's better at scrubbing around for some of this stuff. Throw in some of our greens. Let's turn it back around, see what we got happening here. Looks like we could use some purples up in here. And I'm going to let this all just rest and bleed and do its thing for a while. And I will check back and we'll see what's gone on how much bleeding it's done and what kind of adjustments we want to make to that. Before all is said and done. Because you can play with this for a couple of hours, and I know a lot of you do like to play. This is one of those things where you can play for a while as it bleeds, and if any of these areas we feel like some of this gets lost, then this is where we'll get to come back in and strengthen some of our paint. So for now, let's just let this rest. My shirt is still very wet, but as you can see, it really has bled out quite a bit. I took about an hour off, and I'm also reaching inside here and wiping up any of the moisture that seeped down through, if that'll help it. Could also set it outside in the sun if, you know, it's the right time of year for you, or by a fireplace or a heater to help speed up the drying. So some of these places have stayed probably a little bit maybe harsher than I would like. I can take a damp brush. I can scrub on them a little bit. I could add a little more paint. I could wait a little longer and see what happens. I can just decide that whatever happens, happens, and it doesn't really matter. So you have a lot of different options of how to deal with it. But if you feel like some of those dark spots are not pleasing, you can get out some more paint, take your large brush, and dampen it and load it again. And we can kind of make a bridge between where we have darker color here and where we have a darker piece of color over there. Scrub it in. And up in here. As well. And you can just play and play and play for a very long time, scrubbing, adding a little color here or there, adding a little more water if you prefer that it bleed a little bit more than it is. Things like that. Okay, then the last thing that I like to do as it's starting to dry, get this to squirt out here, is brush some glimmer all over the place. And this is still very, very wet, so it could still bleed a lot. So I want to get my glimmer moist. And remember, I said it's going to dry clear. You can see up here that it did. It looks like white splotches right now, but all it's going to have is glitter after it dries. Just kind of makes it pretty that way. And that's all you need to do. So now that you saw what mine looks like, if you don't want to do this, just leave it the way it is without a painted background. Try it on a different color shirt and lighter colors and have the colors bleed a lot more. You can see here's the photo of my original, and the background is a lot softer. I had it bleed out a lot more. It's just kind of tints of color. And this one may bleed even more. You can probably come to a convention someplace like Hoot in Columbus and see this sample after it's clear, done, and dry. or maybe I'll post it as one of the examples on my website at qualityart.com. So thanks for painting with me.